was 9:40 at night when Luca Moretti's car pulled back into the empty parking lot of Prescott Academy. His daughter had forgotten her art portfolio, due first thing in the morning, and Luca had learned 2 years into raising Sophia alone that some fights simply weren't worth having. The security guard at the gate looked surprised to see them at all. "Everyone left hours ago," he said, waving them through. "Miss Bennett didn't," Sophia said from the back seat, already unbuckling. Luca assumed she was confused. She led him through the dark halls with total confidence, straight to her classroom door. It was locked from the inside. Sophia knocked in a small, specific rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, and after a long moment, the door opened. Emma Bennett stood in the doorway, still dressed in the clothes she'd taught in that morning, her hair coming loose, her eyes heavy with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept anywhere comfortable in longer than one night. Behind her, a folded jacket sat propped on a reading chair like a pillow. A cold, half-finished coffee sat on her desk. A small travel bag was tucked behind the bookshelf. "Why are you sleeping here?" Luca asked. "I'm not," Emma said quickly. "Yes, she is," Sophia said, already crossing to the window. She pulled the curtain back with 2 fingers and pointed across the street. A black sedan sat idling under the street lamp, windows tinted, engine running in the cold. "That car waits for Miss Bennett every day," Sophia said, calm as weather. Emma's face went pale. She glanced at the window, then quickly away from it, the particular reflex of someone who had spent weeks training herself not to stare too long at things that frightened her. In under 2 minutes, Luca understood he had walked into something far more complicated than a forgotten portfolio. This wasn't a woman with nowhere else to sleep. This was a woman who had stopped going home. Emma was 31, a scholarship teacher in a school built for children whose families could have bought the building without noticing the cost. Wealthy parents spoke to her like hired help. The administration treated its biggest donors with a deference it never extended to the woman who spent 8 hours a day with their children. But Sophia had trusted Emma since almost her first week in that classroom. It had started small, that first autumn after Sophia's mother died, with Emma simply saving her a seat at the reading corner instead of letting the other children arrange themselves around her without noticing the quiet girl left out. Then it grew into 15-minute conversations after the other students had gone home, Sophia talking through drawings of her mother she never quite showed anyone else, Emma listening without ever once rushing her toward being fine before she was ready to be. By the end of that first year, Sophia had stopped checking exactly where the exits were before she could settle into her seat. She was the first adult outside their own house Sophia had let close to her since her mother died. "I don't need an explanation," Luca said. "I need to know why there's a car watching my daughter's teacher, and why you're too frightened to go home." Emma glanced at Sophia, weighing how much a 7-year-old should hear, then sat down slowly on the edge of her desk, the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks finally catching up with her all at once, now that someone was actually asking the right question. "3 weeks ago, I found a folder in the admin office that wasn't mine to see," she said. "I'd been asked to carry it back to the front desk during a break between classes. Nothing unusual about that. A few pages slipped loose in the hallway. I knelt down to gather them before anyone stepped on them, and that's when I actually looked." Her hands tightened in her lap, remembering it. Copies of pickup records, home addresses, family travel schedules, printed on a different machine than the school usually uses, sorted by family in a way that had nothing to do with anything I recognized. She swallowed. Sophia's file was in it. "I reported it," Emma continued. "I assumed it was a security lapse someone needed to know about. The headmaster told me I'd misunderstood what I saw, that I'd stumbled onto ordinary insurance paperwork and let my imagination run past what was actually there." Her jaw tightened. "I went back the next day, told myself I was returning something else, and looked again anyway. I wasn't imagining it." Within a day, the first parent complaint arrived, then another. Within a week, the school had opened an informal review of her teaching. Within 10 days, the car appeared, following her home each night before vanishing down a side street, its plate changing every time she managed to note it down. "I called the police," Emma said. "There's never enough for them to act on. It never gets close. It just waits." "And you stopped going home," Luca said. "I stopped feeling safe going home," Emma said. "It amounts to the same thing at midnight, in an empty parking lot." She told him about the night it had gotten close enough to actually frighten her. The first time, 3 nights earlier, when she'd left later than usual and found the sedan already parked directly across from her building, instead of trailing behind her the way it always had. She'd stood frozen on the sidewalk for a full minute, keys clenched so hard in her fist the metal had bitten into her palm, before she'd simply turned around and walked back toward campus instead, 3 miles in the cold, rather than risk her own front door. She hadn't gone home since. Luca studied her for a long moment. "I can make this disappear tonight. You'll never see that car again." "I don't need you to make someone disappear," Emma said, sharper than she meant to be. "Then what do you need?" he asked, genuinely thrown by the refusal. "I need enough time to prove I'm not imagining this," she said. "I need someone to believe what I saw without deciding for me what happens to whoever put it there." It was not the answer Luca was used to hearing from anyone. He offered protection instead, a guard for her walk to her car, somewhere safer to sleep than a locked classroom. Nothing more, for now, though it cost him something to hold back the instinct to simply end the threat the way he ended every other threat in his life. Emma accepted, on the condition that it stayed exactly that: protection, not control. The woman Luca assigned to her, a quiet, capable presence named Reyes, kept a respectful 10 feet of distance at all times, never once making Emma feel watched the way the sedan had. "You don't have to thank me every time," Reyes said, when Emma did exactly that for the 4th evening running. "I'm not used to anyone doing this without wanting something back," Emma admitted. "Mr. Moretti wants something back," Reyes said, not unkindly. "He just hasn't figured out yet how to say it's you he wants, not a favor owed." Emma didn't have an answer for that. She thought about it the whole drive home. 2 nights later, Luca came to her with a single folder and set it on the table between them, without a word of preamble. It had taken his people less than a day to trace the plate through 3 shell registrations, a process Emma didn't ask him to explain, and he didn't offer to. He'd simply told 2 of his men to find out who owned a car that patient, that expensive, that careful about never once breaking a law worth arresting anyone over, and by the following evening, the answer had been sitting on his desk in a single sealed envelope. "The car belongs to Hale," he said. Emma stared at him. "Victor Hale? Chairman of the board? He's shaken my hand twice in 6 years and never once learned my name. He barely acknowledges I'm in the room at the spring gala. Why would he have someone watching me?" "He knows your name now," Luca said, and something in his voice had gone flat and quiet, in a way Emma hadn't heard from him before, the particular stillness of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how much restraint a situation still deserved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Emma watched him set the folder down with deliberate care, as though handling it roughly might cost him the composure he was clearly working to hold on to, and understood, in that small, controlled gesture, exactly how dangerous the man across from her actually was when he wasn't trying to reassure anyone. It wasn't a rival family. It wasn't anyone from Luca's world at all. Victor Hale had spent years quietly using his position on the board to copy Prescott Academy's most sensitive family files: pickup records, custody schedules, home addresses, security routines, and sell access to anyone with enough money and enough reason to want leverage over the families who ran half this city. It was never only about the money, though the money was substantial. Victor had built something closer to a private intelligence operation, disguised as a school board seat, a way to know which powerful families were vulnerable, which marriages were failing, which children could be reached if reaching them ever became useful to the right buyer. Being the man who quietly held that kind of information made him someone every wealthy parent in that building needed to stay on good terms with, whether they understood why or not. One name kept surfacing in the records Luca's people pulled together: a woman named Patricia Okafor, a Prescott mother who had spent 18 months fighting a bitter custody battle, only to watch her ex-husband's attorney arrive at every single hearing already knowing her exact work schedule, her new apartment's address, even which weeks she'd planned to travel for her sister's wedding. She had assumed, for over a year, that someone close to her was leaking the information. She had fired a nanny over it. She had stopped trusting her own sister for months. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was smaller and colder than betrayal by someone she loved. A stranger on a board of trustees had simply sold her daughter's school file to the highest bidder, and she had never once considered that possibility, because it had never once occurred to her that a school would let something like that happen at all. Sophia's file had been copied along with dozens of others, but the real target now wasn't a file. It was Emma, the only person outside Victor's circle who knew the system existed at all. "He's been doing this for years," Emma said quietly, "and I found it by accident on a Tuesday." "Which is exactly why he can't afford to let you keep your job," Luca said. "A discredited teacher's word means nothing. A believed one ends him." The following weeks turned into something neither of them had expected to navigate side by side. Emma fought to hold her position while the school's scrutiny sharpened into something closer to a campaign. Luca learned, more than once, the difference between protecting a person and simply taking over their life for them. A lesson that cost him some real effort, given how little practice he'd ever had holding himself back from a threat. And Sophia, quiet in the middle of it, kept handing her father small, unfiltered pieces of a story she didn't fully understand. "The principal doesn't like Miss Bennett anymore," she said one night over dinner. "I heard him tell her to think about whether her job was worth ruining her life." Another evening. "Miss Bennett goes out the back door by the gym now. And the man from the car walked past our window twice today." She wasn't solving anything. She was simply telling her father what she'd seen, and it was that unfiltered honesty that kept Luca oriented to exactly how serious this had become, even as the adults around Emma worked hard to make it look like nothing. Despite everything, Emma still showed up to teach every morning at 7:15, still knelt beside desks to help small hands form their letters, still stayed 45 minutes past dismissal most days grading spelling tests. She didn't technically need to grade that carefully. One afternoon, a boy named Marcus, struggling for weeks with reading aloud in front of the class, finally made it through an entire paragraph without stopping, and the whole room, unprompted, broke into applause. Emma felt her eyes sting, standing there in a classroom she might lose within days, watching a child do something hard and brave in front of people who loved him for it. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of small, ordinary miracle Victor Hale had never once bothered to notice happened in that building at all, too busy counting what the school's files were worth to anyone willing to buy them. Luca paid the headmaster a single visit that same week, alone, without Emma's knowledge and without a single raised word. He sat across the desk from a man who had spent a decade running that school with total confidence in his own authority, and simply asked him to walk through, in detail, exactly why he had dismissed a 6-year teacher's formal report without so much as opening the folder she'd described. The headmaster's answers grew thinner with every question, his composure fraying under the particular, patient silence Luca let stretch after each one. "Mr. Moretti, I assure you, Prescott Academy takes every concern seriously." "You told her she misunderstood what she saw," Luca said quietly. "Before you'd asked her a single follow-up question, I'd like to understand why a report involving my daughter's own file received less curiosity than a parking complaint." The headmaster had no answer that survived the question, and Luca left the office without threatening him at all, without needing to. Word of that visit moved through the administration within hours anyway, the way it always did in institutions built on careful hierarchies, and Emma noticed, without fully understanding why, that the formal review of her performance quietly stalled out entirely the very next day. It got worse before it got better. One afternoon, a mother Emma had exchanged pleasant small talk with for 6 years planted herself directly in the classroom doorway as the children lined up for dismissal, her voice pitched to Carrie. "I read the paper this morning," the woman said. "I want to know exactly what kind of woman my daughter has been sitting 3 feet from all year. Mrs. Calloway, I'd be happy to talk to you privately." "I don't want privately," the woman said. "I want you to hear me in front of everyone here. Stay away from my daughter." The hallway had gone quiet enough that every word carried. A cluster of second graders stood frozen midline, watching with the particular, wide-eyed stillness, children reserved for adults, behaving in ways they don't have a name for yet. Emma felt her face burn, felt every eye in that hallway waiting to see whether she'd cry, or fight back, or simply fold, and made herself do neither. "I understand you're frightened by what you read," Emma said quietly. "I would be too. It isn't true, but I can't make you believe that today, and I won't argue about it in front of your daughter." The woman pulled her child from Emma's class that same afternoon. The seat sat empty the next morning, a small, visible wound in the middle of a room Emma had spent 6 years building into somewhere safe. Sophia saw all of it. She said nothing about it for 2 days, and then, tucking into bed one night, she asked her father a question in a small voice that stopped him cold. "Did I get Miss Bennet in trouble because I told you about the car?" Luca sat down on the edge of her bed. "No, baby, you told me the truth. The trouble belongs entirely to whoever is scared of that truth." "But everyone's mad at her now," Sophia said, "and it's because of what I said." It was Emma, arriving the next morning to find Sophia unusually quiet at her desk, who finally got the truth out of her, kneeling beside the small chair the way she always knelt for frightened children. "None of this is your fault," Emma told her. "You saw something true and you said it out loud. That's never the wrong choice, even when grown-ups make it feel complicated." "Promise?" Sophia asked. "Promise," Emma said. Luca, watching from the doorway, said nothing. He didn't need to. He was beginning to understand exactly what kind of woman his daughter had chosen to trust. It was a smaller moment, weeks into the ordeal, that told Emma something about him she hadn't expected. She'd fallen asleep at his kitchen table one night, grading papers she'd refused to abandon even mid-crisis, and woke sometime past midnight with Sophia's small quilted blanket draped carefully over her shoulders. Luca was across the room, pretending to read something on his phone, pretending he hadn't just done it. "You didn't have to do that," Emma said, still half asleep. "I'm learning," he said, not looking up. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. It was that same week, late enough that Sophia had long since fallen asleep upstairs, that Luca told her about Elena for the first time. Not the polished, careful version he gave to reporters and old business associates, but the real one. A car accident that he had never fully believed was only an accident. 2 years of grief he'd buried under work and walls and armed men at every door. A daughter he'd tried to protect by controlling every variable around her instead of simply being present in the ones he couldn't. "I built this entire life around making sure nothing could touch her again," he said. And then a woman with a coffee thermos and a stack of ungraded spelling tests did more for her in 6 months than I managed in 2 years. "That's not a competition," Emma said gently. "No," Luca agreed, "but it's the truth, and I've spent a long time avoiding those when they're inconvenient." Emma didn't know what to say to that either, so she simply let the silence sit between them, comfortable in a way silence rarely was in that house. The black car came back for real, 10 days later, and this time it wasn't waiting outside an empty parking lot at night. It pulled into the school's afternoon pickup line at 3:10, sliding smoothly into the queue of minivans and SUVs like it belonged there, and a man in a gray suit stepped out at the curb holding a printed pickup authorization slip with Sophia Moretti's name typed across the top. Emma was on carpool duty that week, checking names against the day's authorized pickup list the way she did every single afternoon, and something about the slip stopped her cold the moment the man held it out. "I'm here for Sophia Moretti," he said, pleasant and unbothered, as though this happened every day. "Authorized by the family office." Emma didn't reach for Sophia. She reached for the slip instead, turning it over, scanning it the way she scanned every piece of paper that crossed her desk anymore, and found 3 things wrong with it inside of 5 seconds. The authorization code printed in the corner used the school's old 4-digit format, retired 18 months earlier when the office switched systems, a detail no current parent would have any reason to know unless they were working from an old copy. The signature at the bottom didn't match the one on file, close but not close enough, the kind of forgery that would fool a distracted afternoon volunteer, but not a teacher who'd checked that same signature 100 times. And the form listed Sophia's mother as an approved contact, using her maiden name instead of Moretti, a detail Emma only recognized because Sophia had mentioned it once, offhand, months before any of this began. "I'm going to need to verify this through the office," Emma said, keeping her voice light and unhurried, already stepping half a pace closer to where Sophia stood in line, close enough to reach her without making it look like anything other than an ordinary afternoon. "It'll just take a minute." "That's not necessary," the man said, and something in his easy tone sharpened just slightly. "The family office already confirmed it." "Then they won't mind me confirming it again," Emma said, and turned, unhurried, walking Sophia calmly back toward the building under the simple pretext of a forgotten homework folder, chatting with her about nothing at all until they were both safely back inside the front doors. She called Luca before she'd even finished locking the classroom door behind them. "He's still in the pickup line," Luca said, his voice gone flat and controlled, in the particular way Emma had learned meant he was holding something back with real effort. "Keep her inside. I'm 2 minutes away." He arrived in considerably less than 2 minutes. By the time his car pulled up, the gray sedan was already gone. Pulled out of line, the moment security radios crackled to life near the front entrance. But the forged slip sat on Emma's desk exactly where she'd left it. Proof enough that whatever information Victor Hale had been selling wasn't sitting quietly in a file cabinet anymore. Someone had used it. "They tried to walk her out of the building with a piece of paper," Luca said, staring at the slip like it might still bite him, using her mother's own name to make it look legitimate. "They didn't get close," Emma said. "She never even knew anything was wrong." "That isn't the point," Luca said. And for the first time since she'd met him, Emma heard something in his voice that sounded less like controlled fury and more like real fear. "The point is that a stranger stood 8 feet from my daughter holding a document built entirely out of things that were supposed to be private, and the only reason it didn't work is that you happened to remember an old office system." Sophia, technically too far away to hear any of it, still noticed enough to ask, quietly, whether she'd done something wrong by going back inside for the homework folder that didn't actually exist. Emma knelt down immediately, the way she always did, and told her, simply, that she'd done exactly the right thing, and that grown-ups sometimes needed a teacher's help even when they didn't say so out loud. It confirmed, for both of them, what neither had wanted to fully admit until that moment. This was never simply about a file sitting somewhere gathering dust, a data breach for lawyers and insurance to argue about at their leisure. Victor Hale hadn't built a paperwork problem. He had built a key, cut carefully enough to open a door that should have never opened at all, and he had just proven he was willing to use it. The public turn came at the school's annual charity fundraiser, a room full of crystal chandeliers, a string quartet working through something slow and self-important, and donors who had come to be seen giving more than to actually give. Emma almost skipped it entirely, exhausted and wary, but skipping felt like handing Victor a confession she refused to give him. She wore the same modest navy dress she always wore to these things, watched the room glitter around her, and felt, the way she always did at these events, like a guest who had wandered in from the wrong party entirely. He waited until she'd arrived and was standing alone near the edge of the room, a glass of water untouched in her hand, before raising his voice just enough to pull the nearest circle of guests into orbit around him. "I think it's worth being honest with everyone here," Victor said, swirling his wine, his voice carrying the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had never once lost a room, about the teacher who's been accessing confidential student files without authorization, obsessively monitoring several of our families, and using a connection to a dangerous man to intimidate this institution into silence. A ripple of shocked, judgmental murmurs moved through the room like a current. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Parents Emma had smiled at in hallways for 6 years now looked at her with the particular, comfortable contempt of people deciding, without a shred of evidence, exactly who deserved to lose everything. Emma felt the glass in her hand grow slick with her own sweat, felt the old, humiliating heat crawl up her throat, and forced herself to stand perfectly still instead of shrinking the way 6 years of exactly this treatment had trained her to. "That's not what happened," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I can prove every word of it is a lie." "Can you?" Victor said pleasantly, already turning half away from her, toward a trustee at his elbow, already moving the room's attention past her, before she could finish a single sentence. "I think we've all heard quite enough for one evening." Someone near the back actually laughed, a short, ugly sound quickly muffled behind a napkin, and Emma felt the entire room settle, almost gratefully, into the story Victor had just handed them. Smaller, sadder, so much easier to believe than the truth. Luca stepped into the room a moment later, and every conversation within 20 feet of the door died instantly. He didn't raise his voice. He crossed the room, stood beside Emma rather than in front of her, and looked at Victor with an expression that had ended careers, and occasionally considerably more than careers, without ever needing to explain what it meant. "Continue," Luca said quietly. "I'd like to hear what you say when she isn't standing alone." Victor's composure flickered, but he had already done what he came to do. He smiled thinly, excused himself to greet another donor, and left the accusation hanging in the room exactly where he wanted it, unanswered, unproven, and already spreading from table to table faster than either Emma or Luca could follow it. Within 2 days, a story broke in the local press, painting Luca as a dangerous man threatening a private school over a teacher he was secretly involved with. Emma's photograph ran beside his, cropped from an old faculty directory shot, sitting under a headline that used the word entanglement like it was already fact. She found out from a student, a boy in her third period class, not unkindly, simply repeating what he'd overheard at breakfast, asked her if it was true that she was the mafia guy's girlfriend. Emma made it through the rest of that class on autopilot and locked herself in the supply closet for 4 minutes afterward, hands braced against the shelving, before she could trust her own face to walk back into a room full of 7-year-olds. By lunch, the story had already reshaped itself through parent group chats and hallway gossip, until Emma barely recognized the version of herself people were discussing a few feet away from her, not always bothering to lower their voices. Colleagues who'd shared a coffee pot with her for 6 years stopped meeting her eyes in the staff room. Someone left an anonymous printout of the article, silently, on her desk overnight, no note attached, none needed. "You can survive being called dangerous," Emma told Luca that night, her voice raw. "I can't survive being called dishonest. Your reputation protects you in your world. Mine is the only thing protecting me in mine." It landed harder than anything Victor had done so far, because Luca understood, with total clarity, that guns and money couldn't restore a name once enough people had decided to believe the worst of it. "Then we don't let them decide," Luca said. "You already have the proof. We put it somewhere it can't be talked over." The final confrontation happened at an emergency session of the Prescott Academy Board, called at Luca's insistence but run entirely on Emma's terms, packed with trustees, parents, attorneys, and, once word spread through the city's social circles, members of the local press who'd smelled a bigger story than the one Victor had leaked. The room was standing room only by the time the meeting opened, every folding chair filled, latecomers lining the back wall, a restless, whispering energy running through the crowd that had nothing to do with school business and everything to do with scandal. Emma stood at the front in the same plain, sensible clothes she wore every ordinary Tuesday, deliberately unremarkable, refusing to let anyone mistake polish for evidence. Victor tried once more to shrink her, his voice pitched for the room rather than for her. "A frightened teacher," he said, "who misunderstood some paperwork and built a conspiracy around her own confusion." "Then let's look at the paperwork together," Emma said, "and let the room decide who misunderstood what." She laid it out for the first time, methodical and unhurried, her hands steady even as her voice carried the faintest tremor of adrenaline. The revision code stamped in the corner of every official student file each time it was printed. A detail so unremarkable almost nobody outside the administration ever noticed it existed. The copies found in Victor's security firm's possession carried codes dated months before Emma had ever reported anything at all, which meant the story that she had stolen and leaked the records collapsed the instant anyone checked the dates printed directly on the paper. A murmur moved through the room as the projected image made the timeline plain enough for everyone in the back row to see it too. Then the security firm's payment records, quietly obtained through channels that owed Luca favors older than Emma's employment history. Then pickup and custody files belonging to families with no connection to each other except the very private information Victor's system had pulled from their children's school records, Patricia Okafor's name among them, projected large enough for the whole room to read, and somewhere near the back a woman's sharp, disbelieving intake of breath told Emma she was in the room to hear it. Emma watched 2 attorneys in the third row exchange a look that told her they'd just recognized their own clients' names on the screen. And finally, Sophia Moretti's own file, copied months before any of this had ever become personal enough for a mafia boss to walk into that room. "I didn't go looking for this," Emma said, her voice carrying clean through the silent room. "I found it because I carried the wrong folder back to the wrong office. Everything since then happened because I refused to pretend I hadn't seen it." Victor's story didn't survive the weight of it. One attorney in the room, representing a family whose custody records had turned up in the stolen files, was already on his phone before Emma finished speaking, already walking toward the exit with the particular urgency of a man who had just found the leverage he'd been missing in a case he'd assumed was unwinnable. Luca stood at the back through the entire presentation and said nothing. He didn't need to. Emma hadn't asked him to fight this for her. He was simply there, making certain she never stood in that room feeling as alone as she had at the fundraiser, without ever once taking the moment away from her. The vote to remove Victor Hale took less than 10 minutes. Several trustees who had spoken warmly of his philanthropy only weeks earlier avoided his eyes entirely as security walked him toward the door. The same donors who had murmured approvingly at the fundraiser, now studying the floor, rather than the man they'd applauded a month before. He tried, on his way out, one last small cruelty. "You ruined everything," he said, passing close enough that only Emma heard it. "No," Emma said. "I read what you thought no one would notice." Sophia crossed the room the moment the meeting ended, wrapping both arms around Emma's waist before anyone could stop her, and looked up at her father with the simple hope only a 7-year-old carries after a night like that one. "Can Miss Bennett come back tomorrow?" "If the board still wants me," Emma said, glancing toward the trustees. It was the newly appointed board chair, not Luca, who answered first. "They do," she said, unanimously. Emma's reputation, restored on the strength of her own evidence rather than anyone's protection, meant more to her than any guarantee of physical safety ever could have. Every family whose records had turned up in Victor's files was formally notified, and several of the city's most prominent attorneys, suddenly aware exactly how their opponents had gained the upper hand in old disputes, filed complaints that would occupy Victor's legal team for years to come. His name came off every donor plaque, every scholarship fund, every building wing across the city that had once carried it proudly, workmen quietly unscrewing brass letters from a wall in the main lobby within the week. The security firm that had tailed Emma for a month lost its contract with 3 other institutions once the full scope of what it had enabled became public. Victor Hale didn't go to prison that week, but the version of his life built on quiet respectability and unquestioned access ended completely, and it stayed ended. The story broke properly 2 days later, this time with Emma's actual account leading it instead of Victor's, and this time the local paper ran a correction so thorough it nearly matched the original smear piece in length. Colleagues who had avoided her eyes in the staff room found small, awkward ways to apologize over the following weeks. Emma accepted every one of them politely and let none of them matter nearly as much as the vote that had already happened, unanimous, in a room full of people who had finally bothered to check the dates on the paper themselves. The black sedan never appeared outside Prescott Academy again. Emma returned to her classroom the following Monday to find it exactly as she'd left it, except for a small bouquet of flowers on her desk, with no card attached, and a note in her mailbox from the new board chair confirming, in writing this time, that her position and her full teaching record had been restored without condition. Several of the same parents who had stared at her with open contempt at the fundraiser now went out of their way to greet her warmly in the hallways, an about-face Emma accepted with polite reserve, rather than any particular satisfaction. She hadn't done any of it to win back their good opinion. She had done it because the truth mattered, regardless of who eventually believed it. Marcus's mother stopped her outside the classroom that first morning back, quiet and a little embarrassed, and said simply that her son had asked, every single day Emma was gone, when his teacher was coming home. Emma held on to that sentence longer than she held on to any of the formal apologies that followed. Even Mrs. Calloway wrote a stiff, careful note asking whether there was still room in the class for her daughter, and Emma said yes, without hesitation, because 6 years of teaching had taught her that fear made people say cruel things they didn't fully mean, and forgiveness cost her nothing that mattered. Sophia, for her part, treated the whole ordeal as already resolved and mostly forgotten, the particular resilience of a 7-year-old whose favorite teacher had simply come back exactly where she belonged. She brought Emma a new drawing almost every week now, and Emma kept every single one pinned along the side wall of her classroom, a small, growing gallery that had nothing to do with anything except a little girl who trusted her completely. It was nearly 2 weeks later, at ordinary pickup time, that Emma stepped out the front doors and felt her whole body go tense at the sight of a black car idling at the curb. Same make, same model. Then the rear door opened, and Sophia climbed out first, clutching a folded crayon drawing in both hands. Luca followed a step behind, hands in his pockets, waiting rather than approaching. Emma looked at the car, then at the two of them, and felt the last of that old fear finally let go completely. "At least this black car," she said, smiling despite herself. I recognize. Sophia held up her drawing, 3 figures together, a sun drawn twice as large as it needed to be. It's us, she said simply. We were driving past, Luca said. Sophia insisted we stop. Sophia insisted, did she? Emma said, arching an eyebrow at the girl, already chasing a bird a few steps down the sidewalk. I might have agreed rather quickly, Luca admitted. Emma laughed, easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in weeks, and took the drawing from Sophia's hands, studying it with the same careful attention she gave everything that mattered to her. 3 figures. A car that no longer meant fear. A sun too large for the corner it was drawn in, exactly the way a 7-year-old sees the world once it finally feels safe again. Thank you for stopping, she said. We'll stop again tomorrow, Luca said, if that's all right with you. Sophia, still chasing her bird a few steps down the sidewalk, called back over her shoulder without turning around. And the day after that. And the day after that one, too. I think, Emma said, watching the girl go, something warm settling behind her ribs. We might be renegotiating the terms here. She does that, Luca said. Renegotiates. It's how she got the dog she wasn't supposed to have until she was 10. There's a dog? There will be a dog, Luca said. Apparently that was also decided without my full participation. Emma looked at him properly then, this careful, guarded man who had learned, in the space of a few dangerous weeks, to stand quietly beside her instead of in front of her, to wait outside a school in a car that used to mean fear and now simply meant Tuesday. Something passed between them that neither one rushed to name. Patient in a way neither of them had been allowed to be patient about anything else in this whole ordeal. I think, Emma said, watching Sophia chase the bird a little further, that would be more than all right. Later that evening, once Sophia had fallen asleep clutching the same stuffed rabbit she'd carried since her mother died, Luca found Emma in the kitchen exactly where she'd first won his trust weeks earlier, and stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching her the way a man watches something he had genuinely stopped believing he was allowed to want. Emma Bennett spent 6 years in that school, being treated like she mattered less than the money that funded it, dismissed, overlooked, and finally targeted by a man who assumed a modest salary meant she could be quietly erased. She proved him wrong with nothing but her own attention to detail and her own refusal to be talked out of what she'd seen. And somewhere in the middle of it, she became the person a lonely little girl trusted most in the world, and the one person a dangerous, guarded man learned to simply stand beside instead of standing in front of. If this story kept you paying attention the way that Black Car kept Emma awake, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who believes the quiet, underestimated people in the room are usually the ones who end up saving themselves. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, would you have trusted your own evidence the way Emma did, even when an entire room had already decided who you were?